Okay, we're going to get started. I'll just let more people in the room as they come in. Welcome everyone to this evening's program. We want to welcome Ms. Anya Tanyavutti, and her presentation is titled Antiracist Birthwork and Antiracist Outcomes. We wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this evening's session, and it will be uploaded to our library's YouTube channel in the following days. And I want to hand it over to Ms. Tanyavutti. I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to unmute while the screen was sharing, but I will move this over so that I can get back to the slideshow. There we go. All right, thank you. So nice to see everyone, and thank you so much, Irene, for putting together a lovely Black History series for Evanston Public Library, and specifically thinking about health and wellness in that regard. I'm excited to be here. As Irene mentioned, my name is Anya Tanyavutti. I'm the Executive Director for Chicago Volunteer Doulas. We are a birth justice organization, and we provide comprehensive doula care for vulnerable communities in Chicagoland. And I'll talk a little bit more about how many clients we serve and the programs that we use to be in solidarity and community with our clientele who we love dearly. And also, I think I'll start off with just explaining what a doula is. It's really important. Sometimes folks confuse doulas with midwives, and midwives are clinicians, and they are folks who understand the clinical aspect of birth and provide support to birthing people and address clinical needs of birthing people. Doulas provide emotional and educational and physical comfort support to birthing folks and folks who are postpartum, folks who are in many different places in their reproductive health journey. There are doulas that provide folks advice and education and support around conceiving, doulas that support abortion, doulas that support families through coping with loss, doulas that also support folks with pregnancy, labor, delivery, and postpartum. And Chicago Volunteer Doula's primary profile is in pregnancy, labor, delivery, and postpartum. And what I want to celebrate today, especially given that there's a focus on health and wellness and during Black History Month, is that anti-racist outcomes are possible. Anti-racist birth work is actually a thing. It is possible, and these outcomes can do not have to be devastating and disparate, falling along the lines of race. So we'll talk a little bit today about how that looks. I want to also introduce myself in a way that feels hopefully comprehensive. These are my professional roles listed here, but I'll introduce myself as I would personally, and I want to also invite you all, if you would like to think about how you would introduce yourself in a comprehensive way, that you can take some notes about that, or if you would like to share that in the chat with one another and practice that you can. I would identify as a queer Black cis woman in a heteronormative marriage with an Asian American man. I am the mother of 3 amazing children who challenge me to be my best self and to support them in being their best selves every day, which is the most complex work that I do on a daily basis. I am a survivor of economic exclusion, As a child, I lived in fairly under-resourced conditions, and I am a survivor of childhood trauma, and all of those lived experiences have a significant impact on how I have experienced the world and how I show up and engage and interact with the world on a daily basis. And I encourage everyone to think about yourself and think about each other in that level of complexity, because we are all carrying that level of complexity on a daily basis as we move through the world, as we interpret the world, and as we interact with one another. And being able to appreciate that level of complexity is core to being able to engage in anti-racist philosophies and ideologies of engaging with the world. So I want to invite everyone, to, if you have not already, to think about the complexity of your identity, including your race, your gender, your income, your childhood experiences, your adult experiences, your professional roles, as well as your personal and informal roles. How would you explain those in short to folks in order to give them a context of the way that you are moving through the world, interpreting the world, and the way you would hope that they would see and witness you in the world? Write that down, and if you feel comfortable sharing that in the chat, I invite you all to do that as well. And I want to honor and recognize that that is a vulnerable thing to do, and encourage us to respect and honor our own as well as each other's vulnerability. So with that said, just this brief agenda, we're going to do introductions. I want to talk about institutional inequity and the historical and contemporary context of institutional inequity, define and explore what a matrix of oppression looks like, which involves understanding our multiple identities that we hold. Spend a little bit of time talking about dismantling injustice. What does it look like for us to defy those historical institutional inequities that have been built in? How do we defy that and produce anti-racist outcomes? We're not going to actually do the scenarios at the end, but we are going to have an opportunity to do collective learning through question and answering. And then we'll close out. That's what I have for us. We're also going to talk about some kind of like foundational agreements that we need to engage with in order to be able to have this conversation and do this work in a way that feels brave and kind to ourselves and to each other. So, yep, I already said consider how to introduce yourselves in the chat.
So feel free. I'm sorry. I was just letting everybody know to feel free to unmute themselves and introduce themselves. And as you said, they can type it in the chat box.
Yeah, so for the sake of time, I was hoping that folks would type it in the chat. If you'd like to pause and have folks do it orally, we can. It just, one, it's being recorded, and so I want to honor that. And two, it may require that we speed through some of the other content later.
Okay, gotcha.
Did anyone have a burning desire to unmute and share orally?
Easier to say it than type it.
Okay. Is that Kristen?
Yeah, I'll dive in. I'm sitting in the changing room at the Y. Forgive me, but I think I'm the only one in here. I am Kristen. I guess I would say I'm an older white woman, cisgendered woman, mostly hetero, maybe kind of going towards non-binary. Have worked as a postpartum doula number of years ago, parent of an adult daughter, and also worked with women's health, instructing med students. Yeah, I had a C-section when my daughter was born, but I think birth support is so important. And afterwards, want to learn everything I can, especially anti-racist stuff. New for me, but so important. I already love what you said.
Thank you, Kristen. And I'll just note, Kristen, that cesarean delivery is also birth. And
Thank you.
we honor all forms of birthing children and
You
folks
rock.
who have cesarean deliveries, including scheduled cesarean deliveries, benefit tremendously from doula support.
Nice.
I'm not noticing anyone else unmuting at the moment. So
Can you hear me?
is that Amanda?
Yes, it is.
Yes, go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, so I'm a middle-aged cisgender white woman, married with kids here in Evanston, and I work as a nurse midwife doing outpatient care. And I also work as a labor and delivery nurse in a hospital setting. And I'm always looking to learn and grow and learn and grow my practice and become a better provider. And I've been working towards, working towards becoming more anti-racist in my practice and developing or being able to see my problem areas and work with them and overcome them and be better and provide better care for all of my patients.
Thank you, Amanda. It's nice meeting you, and congratulations on your journey and thank you for your work on your commitment to birth work. And Kristen, I also wanted to note you sharing your gender journey. One of the things that's really important to Chicago volunteer doulas is being LGBTQ inclusive and recognizing that not every birthing person identifies their body as a woman, and that many birthing people identify along the gender spectrum, including being gender nonconforming in many ways, including being non-binary, identifying as men, and on all bodies that identify along the gender spectrum that have uterus are able to give birth, and we want to honor that and create safe and loving and caring and healthy spaces for that journey. And so I thank you for sharing that, and it's certainly a part of the social justice and anti-racist lens and approach that we do with CVD.
Yay.
Okay. So barring anyone else wanting to introduce themselves, I'm going to move on to our assumptions and our agreements. So starting with our assumptions, I think it's really important when having these conversations to start off with being very clear about what the ideological foundation of the conversation is. And so these are, and I would encourage, and whenever you engage in any discussion that presents itself as an equity discussion, that you ask, what are the underlying assumptions and ideological foundations of your presentation, so that you can be clear if they align with where you are or not, and that will give you some insight into how you align or not with the information and help you to make meaning of it. So my first assumption listed here is that we're human first. We have our ethnic identities, and that is layered on top of our human experience, right? And so we have human bodies that in many ways function very similarly, have similar reactions and origins. We have ethnic identities that are layered on top of our human experience that help us to make meaning of the world. How did our ancestors and culture sharing groups teach us to honor new life? How did our ancestors and culture sharing groups teach us to nourish our life? How do we communicate and celebrate our lived experiences? What kinds of music and foods do we use to express that? You know, what are the ways that we honor the passage of life? Those are the ethnic inheritances that we live and that we carry. Our racial identity has been layered on top of that. And so even though, and I think this is very important to internalize, even though race is a social construct, which means that it's made up, it is also a very real lived experience. But that is not made up. The lived experience of the social construct is very real and concrete. And the outcomes associated with the impact of that social construct, the policies, the practices, the structures that have been in place, those are very real. And I have here, you know, for example, in the US, social identification and access to rights, resources, and power based on color of skin, features, and hair texture, identified as Black or white, are racial identities. And the last assumption here is that race, class, and power are inextricably linked in our country. And we will talk a little bit about the historical content that demonstrates the way those things are intertwined, but they are very much intertwined, and it is a part of the air that we breathe on a daily basis, and it is something that we cannot necessarily fully extract ourselves from, but we can work on a daily basis to try to dismantle it by just a little bit. And it does have an impact for us to intentionally do that. So that's the assumptions that are underlying this presentation. Some agreements that I need us to make. These agreements are from Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race, which are commonly shared in Beyond Diversity training, if any of you all have done a Beyond Diversity training. So these are agreements that are supportive of having productive conversations about race and anti-racism and racial equity. Stay engaged. And so, you know, one of the things I think is really important to note is that the act of stratifying humans along the line of race and removing access to human rights along the lines of race is a trauma. It is a trauma to the human body and the human psyche. It's a trauma to our collective humanity. And there are some ways that humans respond to trauma. And one of those ways is to try to get away from it, to escape it. And sometimes we escape it by making mythical stories, by just being in our imagination. Sometimes we escape it by emotionally disengaging. I don't care about that. I don't want to do it right now. It's not important, et cetera. And so that is one of the reasons why this agreement is so important. If we want to do the work of dismantling this air that is constantly around us to make it more healthy and less racist, if we want to do that work, we have to stay engaged, even when it gets uncomfortable, which leads to the next agreement, which is to experience discomfort. It is not comfortable to acknowledge trauma. It is not comfortable to recall difficult memories, but refusing to experience that discomfort means being complicit with the inhumane experiences of your neighbors and friends and your fellow humans. And so it's important that we stay engaged and we allow ourselves to experience that discomfort for the sake of where it's going to take us, which is to hopefully more anti-racist relationships and experiences and less discomfort. The next agreement is to speak from your own experience. It's really important. One way that humans tend to disengage and distance themselves from difficult conversations is to speak from other people's experiences. So instead of saying, this is something that's hard for me, someone might say, this was something that was really hard for my aunt. She always had this problem. Or my neighbor could never have these types of conversations because they have all these problems. That is actually not useful for staying engaged. And so what I'm suggesting is that you speak from your own experiences, try to use I statements, try to keep it as proximate to yourself as possible, and to challenge yourself to do that internally as well. If you're consuming this information and your first thought is about how other people don't know how to understand it, as opposed to thinking about what is easy or difficult for you to understand, then you're probably not going to get as much as you could from the conversation. And lastly, please expect and accept non-closure. We're going to try to, I try to prepare as thorough and rich as a presentation as possible for you all, and build in a lot of time for Q&A, which is some time for us to learn and explore together. However, that we're still not going to be able to do it all. And so there's going to be some feelings of, oh, I wish I learned more about this, or I wish I dug more into that. But expect and accept that that's part of this process, because we are talking about 400 years of trauma and colonialization, and we're not going to resolve and untangle every single bit of how that shows up in Birthwork in one presentation tonight. So there are 6 conditions that support having these conversations. Keeping your engagement personal, local, and immediate, isolating race in conversations, normalize the social construction and multiple perspectives associated with race, monitor agreements and, monitor agreements and establish parameters, which we're doing now. Establish a working definition for race and examine the presence of whiteness. And this is also from Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race. And those conditions are extremely important in any context if you're having a conversation about race. So please feel free to apply them frequently. And lastly, I like this palliative care circle as a guide for these types of conversations. So I'm going to talk you through this model and tell you how it applies to these types of conversations. So there's this was created for hospice care and to give folks an idea of how to be supportive, where the love, support, and flexibility should flow, where the stress, confusion, and expression of need should flow. And so when we're talking about conversations about race and oppression, the person who is most aggrieved or afflicted would be here. So in the case of hospice, this would be the person who is in hospice care, the person who is aggrieved or afflicted with illness. The next circle would be their children. This next circle out is their significant other or their parents. The next circle out is their close friends. And then there's, I think, colleagues, and then looky-loos. And then you'll see there's 2 arrows. There's the comfort arrow. You can see it goes in towards the concentric circles in. And then there's the stress arrows. That's what dumps out of the concentric circles. So the closer you are to the center, the more you should feel comfort. The closer you are to the outside of the circle, the more you should be prepared to experience the stress of the situation. So for example, pre-COVID example, if you were out at a restaurant and there was somebody who was aggrieved and afflicted there with their family and you didn't know them, and they were struggling to get in and out of the restaurant. Would it be appropriate for you as the looky-loo to say, oh my gosh, or to say to one of the children of the aggrieved, or one of the children of the aggrieved, oh my gosh, this is so stressful to see you all struggling like this. It's really making me think of my own mother. I'm gonna go call my mom because I'm so sad that you're experiencing sadness. Would that be appropriate? It would not be appropriate, because that would be dumping stress in, and that's the opposite of what looky-loos are responsible to do. Looky-loos are responsible to dump comfort in. And that is generally a social expectation that we have. Would it be appropriate for a looky-loo to say, can I help you with the door? It would be appropriate for the looky-loo to provide some comfort or support. If the family said, no, don't touch the door, and in fact, we don't even want you anywhere near us, would that be okay? That would be okay, because the looky-loo should be okay with experiencing some of the stress that needs to dump out from the trauma, because they are most removed and most protected from it. And the folks who are closest to it need the most comfort in coping. And so in this model, what I'm suggesting is, as we are having conversations about oppression and the trauma of oppression, is that the folks who are most afflicted and who are experiencing that trauma in a very real and lived daily experience are at the center. And the folks who are maybe observing that experience or experiencing it in a secondary way are in these outer circles. And that we should expect our comfort and our stress to move according to this model as we have our conversation. Are there any questions about this or any of the agreements or assumptions? Okay, I'm gonna move on to a little bit of historical context, and then I want to skip ahead to our anti-racist birthwork and outcomes. So historical context, thinking about the air that we breathe and how we end up being embedded in a system that produces racist outcomes over and over and over, to the point that folks will imply that these racist outcomes are normal. It is not normal to have some humans be very badly treated, or some humans experience negative, disproportionate outcomes repeatedly in every single institution. We should not normalize that. It is possible for that to be different. But one of the ways that that has happened is because of the history, the founding history of our country, and how policy has embedded those outcomes over and over. And so while we have this conversation, I'm defining race as color of skin, proximity to Africanness, or proximity to Europeanness in terms of skin color, features, hair texture, etc. Class, I'm talking about income as well, or as wealth, assets, and other resources, and power is the capacity to influence the behaviors and experiences of other folks and events. This information is taken from Jackie Badalora's Birth of a White Nation. And if you all don't know Jackie Badalora, you should know her. She's a local Evanstonian, incredible professor and author and thinker. And her book is widely accessible. And I think she's in the process of, or has recently published, a sequel. Prior to 1691, the term white as a racial identity didn't exist. The delineation of demographics in the colonies was British or English, freedom or freeborn or Christian, Negro, mulatto, or Indian. And so that's important to know, because race is a social construct, as we mentioned, and it's important to understand why race was created. And so that's what we're going to dig into here. And I will note that with these demographic descriptions, it's important to note that it's not that differences in appearances were not noticed. It's that there was not a policy defined, associated specifically with defining whiteness as a race. And it's also important to note that chattel slavery existed before 1990 or 1691. And so there was harm that was happening along the lines of proximity to Africanness in our country before 1691. But the racial identity of white did not occur. And the reasons for that racial identity of white had not been defined in terms of policy. And it's these repeated implementations of law and policy that have created institutions that replicate racist outcomes. So the creation of whiteness occurred in response to the Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. The rebellion represented a united European and African labor force rebelling against unpaid labor, the plantation elite, and those governing in the Virginia colony. So in response to seeing humans of multiple different backgrounds coming together to oppose class oppression, the elites considered, how can we divide those humans that are united with one another against us? How can we make those humans, some of those humans, a large enough subset of those humans, betray their fellow fighters in order to align themselves with us? And they thought, we can tell them a lie. We can make up a rule, a legal status. And we can say, you can have a little bit of extra power. You can have a little bit of extra status. And it's going to require that you betray the folks who you've been fighting side by side with, but you can do that and you can become white. The white legal status was created in 1691 as a means to define and distribute power based on color of skin, and to encourage folks to not define their allegiances according to class and income and working conditions. And so in Birth of a White Nation, it says, in rapid succession, Afro-Americans lost their right to testify before a court, to engage in any kind of commercial activity as a buyer or seller, to hold property, to participate in the political process, to congregate in public places with more than 2 or 3, to travel without permission. And that was a quote from Gary Nash that was in Jackie Battalora's Birth of a White Nation. At the time, if we think about what it would mean in 1691 to not be able to engage in any kind of commercial activity as a buyer or a seller in public. There was not a Walmart, there was not a Target, there was not like a private little alcove that folks could go to in order to engage in commercial activity, right? So these laws criminalize being alive as a person who was identified as Black, and made fluid and free the human existence of being white. In rapid succession, all of a sudden, there were some folks whose humanity was considered to be full and recognized and privileged, and other folks' humanity that was considered to be not worthy of protection, not worthy of having basic needs met, not worthy of being able to be an autonomous adult. So that was a betrayal of, right, neighbor to neighbor, like friend to friend. That was a betrayal of people's probably humanity to make a choice to accept privileges for themselves and look at the people that were once their friends and their peers and allow them to be treated poorly. And folks made that choice in order to, because they didn't want to be treated poorly. But I don't think we can normalize that. And so we need to take a look at how that choice became normalized and became embedded in policy and became comfortable for folks for many, many centuries. One of those things is to understand how the Supreme Court and the legislator have been used over and over to reify these beliefs, to obfuscate racial progress, to undermine racial progress and allegiances. In 1790, the Naturalization Act said that only white could become naturalized citizens. Again, saying that Blackness is just not fully human and therefore doesn't deserve citizen identification. And also it was meant to reify the existence of chattel slavery. 1857, Dred Scott Supreme Court decision said people of African descent could not have citizen status again. And so the Supreme Court again reified an inhumane and brutal belief system. 1865, 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime, which allowed for systems to continue to hold captive and force unpaid labor onto folks of African descent, and gave it legal protection to do that. In 1866 to 1928, convict leasing was a thing. And so that was essentially companies coming to communities and getting all of the prisoners out of the prison and paying those communities for those prisoners so that those prisoners could work for them for free under the law, under that exception in the 13th Amendment. And it was a brutal practice, convict leasing was, also called peonage, because communities would make up laws that would allow them to then round up as many Black people as possible, put them in the jail, and wait for the companies to come through to get the free labor. And so folks would be falsely maligned and criminalized in order to serve as free labor. And in many of our penitentiaries, we still see folks who are held captive and providing free labor. But convict leasing, wait, oh, that clicked on this. And I need to stop sharing so I can get back.
You also, I'm
me
sorry,
just a
you also had a question and a introduction in the chat box.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't see the chat box while I am
That's okay.
doing the screen share. Okay, yes, the author is Jackie Badalora, and she is an Evanstonian and District 65 parent, and a local professor. Okay, we're back in business. And lastly here, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, reified the existence of and the constitutionality at the time of separate but equal facilities, and essentially said that it was okay for communities to invest differently in their populations. And we saw that deeply affecting all of our institutions. And what we know most notably about is our schools, given the later integration of schools because of the Supreme Court ruling. But it affected all of our institutions that were allowed to offer separate but equal experiences and unevenly invest in citizens that were paying taxes towards the common good of the government. And so in 1930s, we saw redlining of Black neighborhoods, which ultimately affected wealth access. And in 1935, the Social Security Act, that was only, the first payments were only given to white folks. Black and brown folks were left out because of an exception that did not allow Social Security to go to domestic workers and farm hands, which at the time were primarily Black and brown folks. In 1944, we saw the GI Bill not be equally distributed to veterans. And I've recently been doing a lot of a look into my ancestry, and I saw several of my great-grandfathers that I did not know who were drafted into World War I and World War II. And this certainly affected the wealth that they were able to pass down or not pass down as a result of this giveaway by the government to some citizens and not others. And we see here that this graph shows how the historical context translates to a contemporary context, which is really important for us to know that Black income is about 64% of white income, but Black wealth in terms of assets and total assets is 5% of white wealth. And that's a very disparate experience, and it has a lot to do with redlining, Social Security disbursements, and GI Bill access that was helpful for building wealth for folks in the early 1900s, early and mid 1900s. And then we see the impact contemporary in terms of the convict leasing and the 13th Amendment exception in mass incarceration, and also the origins of policing in starting with slave catching, translating into over policing and disproportionate experiences of violence by Black and brown populations. These things are embedded into those institutions. And then when we talk about healthcare, I have some historical and contemporary context for healthcare. The father of gynecology was a white man who borrowed Black enslaved women from his peers and performed experiments on them without anesthesia. One of those experiments was meant to access the bladder, which required that he did episiotomies over and over on women without any anesthesia in 1845. And for that brutal, torturous behavior, he is considered the father of gynecology. And so it is not surprising that gynecology results in very disproportionate experiences for folks along the lines of race, given its origins. And it's really important to contend with that when processing how one executes the science of gynecology, to understand that it is rooted in a belief that Black women are not fully human, that Black women do not experience pain, that Black women are objects. That is the origins of gynecology. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, that did not occur long ago. From 1932 to 1972, it was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service and observed the progression of untreated syphilis in African American men who were told that they were receiving treatment. And so folks who were experimenting on autonomous humans watched them for the purposes of science degenerate mentally and struggle tremendously and without giving treatment, but telling them that they were receiving treatment. And that happened from 1932 to 1972 by the US government. And so when folks are wondering why there are certain communities that are vaccine hesitant, this history has a significant role to play in why there are certain communities that simply do not trust public health departments, that do not trust medical institutions. And unless institutions contend with their history and engage in repair and engage in building trusting and meaningful relationships with those who have been harmed and marginalized by them, then we won't see a difference in outcomes. Henrietta Lacks did not give consent to her cervical cells being harvested. She did not give consent nor receive compensation for the extraction and use of her cells that are studied and used to this day in scientific studies. And so that was from 1951 to the present that happened, because her cells are able to replicate. And so they have been replicated since 1951, and they're still used in science. And so there needs to be acknowledgement and repair for these tremendous harms by health sciences to the Black community and to many marginalized communities in order to create relationships of trust where folks feel like they are safe and can be honored and cared for properly. And so these are some of the results, the contemporary results of that historical health content. And these are taken from the Illinois Department of Public Health. And so to be specific, I am keeping it local, proximate, and immediate. In the nation, there are states that have higher rates of disproportionality and states that have lower rates of disproportionality. Illinois is probably on the higher end. And so I will give you the national rates and the Illinois rates. In the national rate, 3 to 4 times more African Americans are dying from preventable pregnancy-related illnesses and medical occurrences than non-Hispanic white folks. In Illinois, 8 times more Black folks, 8 times more Black folks are dying from these preventable pregnancy-related health outcomes or health crises. In Illinois, 3 times more Black infants die to Black folks than to non-Hispanic white folks. And in postpartum, 2 times more African Americans will experience life-threatening pregnancy-related complications. 56% of these are in postpartum, 3 times more Black infants. In Illinois, I'd say 3 to 4 times more Black infants suffer unexpected death than those of other races. We see disparities in our public health data for breast and chest feeding, as well as for low instances of low birth weight, as well as for instances of preterm labor as well. And so if folks are paying attention to achieving anti-racist outcomes in birth work and disrupting this contemporary context of the history that we have inherited, then this data needs to be known, and these outcomes need to be tracked, and they need to be tracked along the lines of race. I will come back to this video if we have time. I wanted to show you some of our Chicago volunteer doulas outcomes and how we achieve what we're able to achieve. And then I'd like to come back to this video, then we can go to Q&A. So yeah, Chicago volunteer doulas, I explained earlier that we are a birth justice organization, and we support pregnant, laboring, newly parenting parents and babies in vulnerable communities. And we do that by offering folks of many different gender backgrounds, information, referral, education, labor and doula support, basic breast and chest feeding, parents support opportunities. Our postpartum program has regular gatherings during COVID via Zoom for new parents and their infants. And we make sure that our doulas are accessible to folks regardless of their ability to pay. We ask folks for donations of what they can afford in whatever increment they can afford it. And we do that with a doula pool that is representative of the communities that we serve. So our clients are of a lot of different marginalized backgrounds, including different marginalized race and ethnic backgrounds, LGBTQ identity, disabled, survivors of violence, those who have experienced pregnancy loss or trauma, having refugee status, or who are religious minorities. Our doulas also represent those vulnerabilities in many regards, and their lived experiences have been translated to really powerful and impactful birth work. And we also serve folks who are economically marginalized. If their income is $50,000 or below, then any of those identifiers would, in our interpretation, define someone as vulnerable of disparate birth outcomes and give them access to having support through CBD. And we provide our support through 5 programs, which is our On-Call Doula program, where we partner with midwifery groups who can call our On-Call Doula to support a client if they are in need while they're in active labor. We have our traditional doula program, which allows folks to match with a doula while they're pregnant, have a prenatal visit, get prenatal education and support through their doula, and then have their doula on call for them during weeks 38 to 42 and get labor and delivery support from our doula. We have our postpartum doula program, which allows folks to have postpartum support after their infant arrives. And that support is defined in partnership between the doula and the birthing person. That support could look like light housekeeping, it could look like meal prep, it could look like just social engagement, and for a lot of folks, it also looks like lactation support. If they want to provide human milk for their children through breast or chest feeding or pumping, where our doulas are able to support that. And we also have a lactation counselor who helps to coordinate the program, who provides lactation counselor support. And we have a peer doula program at Logan Correctional Facility, where folks who are incarcerated, who already provide a lot of love and care to each other, have been trained to be doulas so that they can specifically provide informed care to their pregnant peers who are also incarcerated and experiencing isolation and lack of adequate health care and sometimes lack of education about their pregnancy experience. And so that is another way that we support vulnerable communities. And lastly, our 5th program is our mentor program. We mentor all of our doulas and make sure that they feel at ease and comfortable and able to grow their knowledge and thrive. We provide quarterly training to our doulas to make sure they have ongoing information access so that they feel fully equipped to provide the most informed and effective care that they can. And so I consider our many clients our clients who are pregnant people and their families and their infants as our clients, but also our doulas. All of our volunteer doulas, we are in service to them as well. And so we had last year over 200 clients. We served them for over 2,700 hours. We also trained over 80 doulas and provided mentorship and ongoing training to them. And we do all of that work in solidarity with our communities. Our staff, our board, our volunteers represent racial and ethnic diversity, also represent LGBTQI identity or IA2+ identity. We have linguistic diversity on our board. We have economic diversity, religious diversity on our board. Our volunteers also represent our communities in those ways, and here are our demographics for our staff, board, and volunteers. But I do note here that representation alone is not radical. It is not enough for us to simply be bodies that have been racialized as Black, or bodies that have experienced the world as queer, or bodies that have gender diversity. It is important that our values be radical. And so our values as an organization are rooted in anti-racism. Our values are rooted in abolition, a queer Black feminist framework, a focus on solidarity, not charity, a focus on being in community with and providing services with and providing care with, not for. It's not a hierarchical top-down charity model. We are recognizing that we are surviving an unjust world together, and we are in loving, caring relationship with our clients, and we respect their dignity and their autonomy, and we want to provide the education and care that we have access to as a way of empowering and uplifting what the beauty and the gifts that we already know exist within our community. And I say that those values are really important because it's those values that impact our results. It is not simply the representation alone. It is our representation, and it is our values and how we uplift and bring our representation to this institution. So what we see is that having the representation and the values as an organization that we have results in really powerful anti-racist outcomes that disrupt and defy the statistics that many folks have said have been normal for years related to birth. And it's really important to conceive of the fact that it does not have to be this way. We can make dutiful, committed steps to change. And when we do that, when we share power, we share resources, we allow folks to both be representative and bring radical values to work, we see that change can happen. And so our clients are over 70% Black and Brown. And honestly, 90% of our clients are people of color, 90%. And 82% of our clients are surviving with a low income. Last year, we served 200 people for over 2,700 hours of care. And we supported folks in maintaining a very low cesarean rate and very low epidural rates. And I think that's really important. These numbers don't match. The previous year was 51% epidural rate. This year was 43%. And I think that it's really important to note that because having an epidural as an intervention is a precursor oftentimes to a cascade of other interventions, pregnancy interventions. And we know that those additional pregnancy interventions oftentimes lead folks to having the experience of not having an empowered birth. And what we want to support folks in is having the birth that they wish for themselves and feeling empowered. A good birth is the birth where someone feels good afterwards. They feel empowered and they feel accomplished and they feel aligned with their birth experience. And that's what our doulas want to support. A doula does not advocate for people. A doula encourages folks to advocate for themselves and provides them with the information, support, and care that they need so that they can lift their voice and they can feel empowered and own their journey. And with that, loving care rooted in anti-racism and abolition and queer Black feminism, we see that we produce a 43% epidural rate, which is far lower than many of our partner hospitals, as well as the state of Illinois. A 19% cesarean rate, again, far lower than our hospitals in the state of Illinois, and a 6% incidence of low birth weight infants with our traditional clients, which is lower than the incidences that occur in Chicago. And so we compare, not only do we collect data, we also disaggregate our data by race and ethnicity, and we also, we disaggregate our data by race, ethnicity, gender, and LGBTQ identity. And we also keep track of the preterm incidences of preterm labor, as well as low birth weight infants. And we keep track of that data. We also compare that data to the Illinois Department of Health and our hospital partners. And I say all of that because it's critical to do anti-racist work that you actually monitor how you're doing, that you actually show an act of care by collecting data and asking yourself, am I doing this well? Am I doing the thing that I say that I want to do? Are the outcomes matching what I say my stated values are? And if they are not, how do I need to adjust? That willingness to be humble and to do the labor of collecting information and analyzing it and course correcting is an act of care. And every marginalized community deserves that type of humility and act of care from every institution that is claiming to actually care, every individual and institution that's claiming to care about them. So if the institution that you work for or your personal practice does not involve collecting data and disaggregating it and course correcting according to it and analyzing it and course correcting, then you're not doing anti-racist work. And then in our postpartum outcomes, we measure confidence and commitment to breast and chest feeding exclusively for the first 6 months of an infant's life, as well as the presence of the 5 protective factors in a family, in their family unit. And we do that with a pre and a post survey. And consistently over the last 3 years, our data has indicated that we demonstrate an increase in commitment to breast and chest feeding as a result of the relationship with our postpartum doulas, and an increase of the presence of the 5 protective factors in the families of the families that our postpartum doulas work with. And so the 5 protective factors are things like confidence in one's parenting, feeling socially connected, having concrete ideas of where to get help if needed, positive understanding of child development, and I think positive self-perception are I think that's the 5. I may have misquoted them, but you can also Google them and find them. It's Healthy Families 5 Protective Factors. And so I think what's really important to know is that when we commit to doing anti-racist birth work, we in fact can produce anti-racist outcomes. And for CBD, you know, our clients have defied the odds for incidences of low birth weight, low breast and chest feeding rates. The expression of systematic racism and marginalization can be defied. This is not something that we need to accept any longer as normal. And if we're not quite sure how to do it, then there are places like CBD that you can come to and ask questions. And there are ways that you can, you know, acquire resources and relationships, or give your time, energy, and resources to, in order to continue to push forward, advocate, and replicate these types of outcomes. I want to look at the oppression matrix that I have, but I'm going to share this video. Irene, if the sound is bad, please let me know.
Okay, I will. I don't hear anything. Okay.
You don't hear anything?
I do now.
Okay, you do. You can hear now?
I can hear now.
Disparities are really the consequences of racial differences in socioeconomic status. And it isn't that simple.
Infant mortality among white American women with a college degree or higher is about 4 deaths per 1,000 births. But among African American women with the same level of education, infant mortality is about 10 per 1,000 births, almost 3 times higher. In fact, African American mothers with a college degree have worse birth outcomes than white mothers without a high school education.
Think about this. We're talking about African American doctors, lawyers, and business executives, and they still have a higher infant mortality rate than non-Hispanic white women who never went to high school in the first place. So what I've been calling for is a rethinking of an old problem from a new perspective, and to really rethink racial and ethnic disparities in birth outcomes from the life course perspective. Simply put, the life course perspective is that birth outcomes are the product of not simply the 9 months of pregnancy, but really the consequences of differential exposures across the life course of women of color. We know that racism is stressful, and we know that stress can impact on health in many different ways. It creates this chronic wear and tear on your body systems to adapt. It wears on the hormonal system, it wears on the immune inflammatory functions, it wears on your metabolic functions, and over time creates an overload on all of these organs and systems so that they no longer function optimally.
Everyday racism is like gunning the engine of a car without ever letting up. In fact, people who've looked at blood pressures, measuring ambulatory blood pressures for white folks and black folks, young folks, see that the blood pressures might be the same during the day, but at night the white folks' blood pressures would drop, and the black folks' blood pressures would stay the same. And so it is. It's like gunning the engine of that car, just wearing it out without rest. And I think that the stresses of everyday racism are doing that.
And then if you were to carry that into the pregnancy, then that gets embedded in the pregnancy physiology of the mother and the developmental biology of the child. Family has done a lot in terms of increasing access and utilization of prenatal care, especially amongst communities of color, and yet we've done very little to reduce prematurity rates. I think that the problem is that with prenatal care, you're trying to cram all these good things into less than 9 months prenatal care, and then expecting everything to turn out all right in the end, and to expect prenatal care in less than 9 months to reverse all the cumulative disadvantages and inequities that's being carried forth over a life course of differential exposures is probably expecting too much of prenatal care. So if we're serious about improving birth outcomes and reducing disparities, we got to start taking care of women before pregnancy. And I'm not just talking about that one visit 3 months preconceptionally, talking about when she's a baby inside her mother's womb, and now infant and a child and an adolescent, and really taking care of women and families across their life course if we really want to do something about improving pregnancy outcomes.
So that was an older video. It was not gender inclusive in the language. And so I apologize for the lack of gender inclusive language. However, the content does acknowledge the role that racism plays in a lifetime of racism plays in the disproportionate outcomes that we see. And that was the primary reason that I wanted to share that video. And he talks a lot about the impact of racism. However, it is important for us to think about oppression as a matrix writ large of many different ways of oppressing and executing power and control socially, economically, politically, over others. The other thing that I wanted to note is he talks about how creating an anti-racist world and anti-racist systems is the solution to changing these outcomes. It's not, so one way that I describe CBD's role in reproductive justice oftentimes is I tell people that CBD is a harm reduction in the world of reproductive justice, on the road to reproductive justice. If we were to be able to completely eliminate the role that racism plays in the lives of our clients, in the systems of the medical institutions that we partner with, and in all of the social systems that our clients are up against, including lack of family leave that requires folks to go back to work immediately, that disrupts some folks' lactation relationship. Like, if we were able to rectify all of that, then that would be true and comprehensive reproductive justice. We cannot rectify all of those systems, but we can reduce harm in those systems. And, you know, by providing anti-racist relationships in solidarity, we are, and that's one thing that prenatal care alone cannot do. Our doulas are not simply encouraging people to get prenatal care. They are operating in loving, culturally relevant relationships with their clients. They are showing up for their clients in ways that make their clients feel represented and feel proud and feel at ease and feel informed and feel less alone. That's not a simple expression of prenatal care. And I think that that's harder to capture in terms of value. But there is an incredibly, you know, innate and intangible value to being interacted with in ways that are representative and loving and rooted in a belief in justice. And so that's another layer that I would like to add to that video. And lastly, I just wanted to walk us through the oppression matrix and then give us a chance to do some questions and answers and some learning together. This matrix is set up with the headings identity, power, non-power, and oppression. And so what this matrix is designed to do is to talk about different identities, how we would consider the power to oppress, or the experience of oppression falling according to that identity, and what the type of oppression described by that, the type of oppression that is described by that interaction of power, non-power. So if we think about race, what race of folks has the ability to express oppressive power in terms of systems? So I'm gonna fill this in. That would be white. What racial category of folks do not have who are experiencing oppression and do not have the power to racially oppress others? And that would be Black and Indigenous. And the type of oppression is anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And then next we have gender, the power group in terms of gender delineation of power, cis men. And the non-power group is women and trans folks. And the type of oppression, transphobia, trans antagonism. And I think that, yeah, so I'm going to go on to the next identity, which is sex. The power group would be those identified as male. The non-power would be intersex and female. The type of oppression is sexism. And so I'm going to continue like this with several different identity groups. And the goal is for us to think about how oppression really shows up in matrices, and this expectation of seeing how power and non-power and oppression intersects in some bodies and lives and not others is a core tenet of queer Black feminism. Intersectionality is a core tenet. Identity, ability, disability, able-bodied, non-power, persons who are disabled or with disabilities. The type of oppression is ableism. Mentally able or neurotypical or neurodivergent, or persons with mental cognitive disabilities or struggling with chronic mental illness are in non-power group. Ableism, age, adults, children and elderly, ageism. We have religion, language, immigrant status, settler, indigenous identity. And so I encourage everyone to think about this matrix of power and to think about how our systems interact with people based on how they fall in this matrix. Think about yourselves and others and how institutions are caring and not caring for folks, given the complexity of how power has been distributed among humans in our institutions. And many of these systems, these levers of oppression, have been designed off of the original policies of racial oppression in this country. We saw that practice of stratifying humans and dehumanizing people and removing citizenship rights from people by replicating racist policies to apply to other ways of being, quote unquote, different. It's important to note that the oppressor group has the ability to define reality for themselves and others, to determine what is normalized. The target group internalizes those negative messages and may find themselves cooperating with them, thinking and acting like the oppressors. One of the stories that I share oftentimes when I mention this bullet point is that when I grew up, myself and my peers frequently communicated not in standard American English dialect that I'm using to communicate with you right now. We communicated in AAVE, African American Vernacular English. And AAVE was a place of ease and comfort and fun. AAVE is very complex. It is artistic and creative. And I have a very loving relationship with AAVE. And the way that it allows for me to connect culturally with my community. But as I was growing up, I was discouraged frequently from using AAVE outside of my informal relationships. And as a result, there came a time where I would spend most of my day never using AAVE, and I almost lost it. And I would have lost something that was comforting and meaningful and loving to me, something that brought humor and creativity and warmth, that brings humor and creativity and warmth to my life. I almost lost it because I thought that because I needed to communicate in standard American English dialect in order to protect my safety, that somehow it was better. It was the preferred dialect. And so I used it to the exception of AAVE. And if I had internalized the message that was actually contrary to my own joy, that was contrary to my own full human expression, which is a cultural practice that has been handed down to me by my ancestors. And I almost lost it because of an internalized message. And if I had lost it and I had not passed on a love and appreciation for it to my children, then that would have been the end of that beautiful practice in my lineage. And that would have been a terrible demise for a beautiful gift of survival that has been passed down for generations that I'm blessed to have. But
Anya,
there are times, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just wanted to let you know that it's 7:27 if you want to take questions.
Yeah, I thought I was going to stop at 7:30 to take questions.
It was 6, it's 6 to 7:30. So.
Oh, in my email earlier, I asked to confirm the times, and I thought we said 6 to 7:30 for a presentation and 7:30 to 8 for questions. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So I had just paced according to that timing, but I can pause here and we can fit in what we can in hopefully about 10 minutes. That's okay?
It's okay. You warned us not to expect closure.
My apologies.
No, my apologies. I'm sorry. But yeah, I'll pause there because the rest of this is written here. And if folks want to read it, you can. And if you have questions, let's dive into those. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see the chat. And then Irene, did you stop the recording for the Q&A?
I do that right now.